welcome to our look ahead at what the papers will be bringing us over the next few hours. With me, Anna Mikhailova, Deputy Political Editor at the Telegraph, and Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at the Observer. Welcome back. We've got another 20 minutes or so to go through the first editions. Just let's look at some of the main front pages. Zooming, fuming. Metro's reference to the Prime Minister's virtual appearance before MPs at the Liaison Committee, in which he was accused of putting politics ahead of public health for sticking by his senior aide Dominic Cummings. Mr Cummings accused of breaking lockdown rules. The Guardian says Tory MPs defy Boris Johnson to pile pressure on Mr Cummings. The paper carries a story that is in a few of the others as well. Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis being rebuked by the BBC, breaking impartiality rules, it says, after criticism of Mr Cummings. The Mail's headline, Test and Trace Revolution, refers to the new scheme beginning in a few hours' time, where people who have come into close contact with a coronavirus sufferer will be told to stay at home for 14 days, even if they don't have any symptoms. Test and trace, the key to our freedom, is how the Express is reporting on what it describes as the world-beating programme that it's hoped will kill off COVID-19. The Telegraph's main headline is that the public are told they have a duty, a civic duty, to test and trace. The Daily Mirror pointedly asks, why don't you do your duty? Paper reporting the government telling the public to do its civic duty to curb the virus, while Boris Johnson continues to back Dominic Cummings. Brits could be back in pubs in June, according to The Sun, which says Boris Johnson believes experts are close to finding a solution for stopping the spread of the virus in bars. I suppose that will depend on social distancing. And the Times main picture story is of the astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken on their way to the Cape Canaveral launch pad before bad weather unfortunately got in their way and SpaceX was postponed, we think now, until Saturday. Let's start. Thank you, both of you, again. Sonia, let's start with you and Boris Johnson's appearance before the Liaison Committee today. Zooming, fuming. I mean, there was a lot of anger, wasn't there, about Dominic Cummings, and a lot of quite forensic questioning as well. How do you think he did?
So I thought it was a pretty disastrous appearance for the Prime Minister. The Liaison Committee is the committee of the most powerful backbenchers in Parliament. It's their opportunity to grill the Prime Minister on the government's agenda. Boris Johnson has failed to turn up once in 10 months, and I think today shows us why. He was really all over the place. He wasn't on top of his brief. Key moments came when he was asked about the conduct of his advisor, Dominic Cummings. Yvette Cooper, in particular, said, you've got to pick. Are you backing your advisor, or are you allowing his actions, breaking the government's guidelines, to undermine the integrity of the government's public health advice going forwards? And it was very clear that Boris Johnson was doubling down and protecting his advisor. So all in all, I think he came across as an incredibly weak Prime Minister who is so reliant on one advisor that he's going to back that advisor and put that above the integrity of the government's public health.
Anna, I was interested in what you said, half an hour ago. You thought that he'd been very well prepared on answering questions about Dominic Cummings. In other words, he wasn't going to move an inch on that. He didn't seem quite so at ease, did he, with some of the more scientific questions and some of those debates about social distancing, for example?
Well, I think obviously the thing to first bear in mind is, as Sonia said, this committee is a collection of the MPs on a whole number of briefs, and they are the leaders in Parliament essentially on their briefs. So it is obviously a task, quite a task for any Prime Minister to face them, but knowing that, as Boris Johnson is usually described as a man of not a details man, that would have been particularly the case. But I think just the sense of it was, Number 10 has been fighting so hard this week to try and get the Dominic Cummings story out of the papers. And obviously today, I thought he came in prepared to face questions on that and really try and, as he said, move on from the story. And then there didn't seem as much room for the other things. I think on the scientific part, obviously the 2-metre rule came up. I actually thought that was very interesting, his answer on the 2-metre rule, because we've reported that the government has commissioned SAGE, the scientific advisors, to review the rule a number of times, in fact, because there are lots in the cabinet who are unhappy about it because they think it was a real impediment to the economy reopening, to public transport, and they look at other countries that have a 1 metre or 1.5 metre rule. And what was interesting to me was Boris Johnson seems to support that. He said that he himself recognises that argument. And even though his answer may have been a bit woolly, I thought it was quite revealing.
Yeah, but Sonia, I mean, some might argue, and I think that they have subsequently, that a Prime Minister is there to listen to the scientific advice and then make a decision, whereas he just seemed to be listening and still sort of deciding without actually sort of reaching the summit, as it were.
Yeah, it wasn't clear at all, and it came across like a Prime Minister who's desperately trying to move the agenda off the conduct of Dominic Cummings, his top advisor, off his breaking of the rules and onto other things. So I think what he was saying about the 2 metre rule, that was trying to sort of give some potential good news that may be coming down the line to try and shift the focus off Dominic Cummings. But certainly the scientific advice that I've seen so far suggests that in this country we went for the 2 metre rule because scientists think that it kind of minimises the risk. So if you go for a 1 metre rule, that more than doubles the risk of transmission through droplets, etc.
Okay, but the easing actually has been picked up by one mass-selling paper, which we'll come to in a moment. Anna, let's go back to the Guardian. Tories defy PM to pile pressure on Cummings, but when you look at the front pages today, especially in the broadsheets, do you think things have moved on? I mean, this is obviously what Number 10 expects and wants to happen, but how do you gauge things at the moment?
I think the sense from MPs, even the ones who've been calling for him to quit, is that there is a little bit of a loss of momentum from them. I think they see with every day that passes that clearly Number 10 and Boris Johnson have absolutely no intention of getting rid of Dominic Cummings, and we saw that very plainly today from Boris Johnson at the Liaison Committee. He kept saying, let's move on, let's move on. Of course, just saying that doesn't make it happen, and I think that one of the things that has slightly stemmed the momentum is the fact that yesterday we had a ministerial resignation, but there haven't been more ministers actually following suit. Although it was interesting, I thought today that Penny Mordaunt, who is a minister in the government, wrote to constituents saying that Dominic Cummings is criticising his actions, not going as far as saying he should quit, but certainly I think saying they were indefensible.
Yeah, OK. And then alongside that, several papers have got actually a picture of Emily Maitlis rebuked by BBC after criticism of PM's aid. This has caused a lot of comment, hasn't it, Sonia? And I think it really depends on where you stand politically, and indeed about the role of the BBC as an impartial deliverer of news, without perhaps making up your mind at the beginning of a programme before you come to discuss issues.
Well, there are lots of questions about what it really means to be impartial, whether there is such a thing. So I watched last night's Newsnight episode. I thought it was really excellent. There's clearly a debate that's been going on about whether Emily Maitlis's introduction was too editorialised or not. I personally thought she was stating the facts. I think it's very clear that Dominic Cummings has broken government guidelines. And just because Number 10 and he asserts that they didn't, doesn't mean that balance doesn't mean that you say, well, there's this version of the truth and then there's this other version of the truth. So I personally didn't think it was too editorialised. Others clearly take a different view, but I think none of that should take away from the fact that I think, and personally think, Emily Maitlis is one of the best interviewers that the BBC's got, and I think Newsnight has been doing a brilliant job at speaking truth to power in recent weeks, in the face of a government that is very, very reluctant to be held to account by this media. It's not been sending ministers to key shows like Newsnight, for example. Boris Johnson, he's taken a very Trumpian tactic and tried to say, well, all these allegations about Dominic Cummings are just false, without being able to say which ones precisely are false, when in fact we know there's a lot of evidence that they're true. So I think Newsnight's been doing a very good job at that.
OK, it's a picture on your paper as well, Anna. Let's move on to we'll come back to you on that as well in a minute. Onto the Daily Express. Test and trace, key to our freedom. The Express very much picking up on how amazing this new test and trace system is, although some suggestions in some quarters, Anna, that it's not quite ready yet.
Well, it all remains to be seen. I mean, the thing that is indisputable is that a good test and trace system, or test, track and trace as it used to be called, is absolutely crucial in actually getting out of this crisis. Other countries have been on top of this much sooner than us. South Korea, for example, this was one of the key ways that it managed to get out without a big lockdown nationwide. So this is crucial to the government's strategy, and certainly the app, which is not part of this initial rollout, but has been promised as one of the features of the system, is delayed. And we were promised that track and trace system up and running by the end of May. Now, there have been some initial reports today that not all of the system is working up and ready yet. Calls may not start to come through until next week. It remains to be seen. I think the government has been quite open about the fact that there'll be kinks in it, and that it will take, because it's been set up pretty much from scratch, it will take time to set up. But this system of being able to actually identify cases, and then the people they've met and spoken to, come into close contact with, who may have become infected, and then to efficiently isolate them, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah. Onto the Telegraph. Sonia, same story there. Public told they have a civic duty to test and trace, but of course behind all of this lies that sort of shadow of Dominic Cummings and what he did do, and whether it was within the guidelines or within the law, and those two are perhaps different.
Yeah, there's two issues with the track and trace scheme that's being launched at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So the first is it relies on voluntarism, on the public complying with what the government's asking it to do, which is if you get a call from a government tracer saying that you've been in contact with somebody who's tested positive for COVID, you need to stay at home, you need to isolate for 14 days. Matt Hancock told us today you've got a civic duty to do that. Now, some members of the public might say, well, when you've got the Prime Minister's top advisor flouting the guidelines, driving 260 miles to Durham when his wife had suspected COVID, when they were supposed to stay at home, do I really need to do what the government says? So I think there's a real undermining of the government's public health message that has happened as a result of Boris Johnson's desperation to keep Cummings in place. I think the second thing with the track and trace scheme is there is a real sort of feeling, I think, that's emerging. We've had contact tracers, contact journalists tonight. We've had local authority directors of public health saying that they're not ready. They've not been properly consulted on this track and trace scheme. So I think there's a real concern in some quarters that this scheme, the launch of it has been rushed, that it's not quite ready to go, that it is more of a government initiative to try and get it out there to distract from Dominic Cummings, that massive political issue and the government's political woes. So I think that that there are those two very worrying things about the track and trace scheme. But as Anna said, it's absolutely critical to preventing a second wave. It's absolutely critical to safely reopening schools, shops, the economy. So it's something the government absolutely has to get right.
Yes, and as the Prime Minister explained, I mean, this is advisory, but there might well be some sort of police fines down the line if people don't adhere to the guidelines, to the rules. Anna, you've got a big picture of Emily on the front as well, who broke impartiality guidelines according to BBC senior bosses here. Alongside that, the 2-metre rule could be reduced, says the Prime Minister. But did you get the opinion today, or the impression today, that he was rather sitting and sort of and looking at this advice and still hadn't made his own mind up? I mean, which way did it work as far as you were concerned in terms of who took the decisions, the scientists or the politicians? Because historically it would always be the politicians.
Well, the way it works is the government ministers ask SAGE to review something. SAGE then will present its findings, and then the cabinet and obviously the Prime Minister in charge of that decides. So I didn't get a sense that he hadn't made a decision on it. I think as we've reported, this is something that SAGE has been repeatedly asked to review, partly because there is a tension there between some ministers who really are keen on lowering the 2-metre rule to 1 metre or 1.5 as a way of trying to kickstart the economy. So I picked up more on the tension there, and the fact that the Prime Minister suggested that he was pro reducing it and trying to. But I think it's absolutely valid that they commission the scientists come back with their findings, and then that is the process.
Well, the Sun's gone one further, hasn't it? Because pubs to open in June, says Tom Newton-Dunn. 2-metre rule may be eased. Ale meet again. It reminds me of that Sun splash, 2 weeks ago, before the Prime Minister's statement about sort of doubling down on the lockdown, which suggested it was going to be freedom Monday and everything's going to be back to normal, Sonia.
Well, I think this has been a consistent problem throughout this pandemic, which is rather than announce policies officially through the Downing Street press conference or to Parliament, Downing Street insists on briefing behind the scenes good news stories, some of which don't actually turn out to happen, to sympathetic papers. And it sows confusion. I think people will look at that and think, oh, well, pubs are probably going to be opening quite soon. That means that actually we can more broadly feel relaxed about the rules, when that may not be the case at all. And I think it's part of this thing where, there's this tension within the cabinet between people who really want to see restrictions relaxed, I think too early, in order to sort of save the economy. And then other ministers are far more concerned about protecting, public health in this pandemic. So there's a real, I think you can see that when you see Boris Johnson's appearances, that he's a very weak Prime Minister. I think he's torn between these sort of two competing objectives. But, at the end of the day, there isn't going to be an economy if there's a it's going to be terrible for the economy if there's a second wave in infections and deaths as a result of the government loosening things up too early. So it really has to be clear when it's going to do that, and that there are the right track and trace systems to prevent or minimise the risk of a second wave. And I think this sort of briefing to sympathetic papers, sort of jolly, all the pubs are going to be open again, I think it's incredibly irresponsible, actually.
A story you regret you didn't have, Anna?
Sorry?
A story you regret you didn't have for a splash?
Well, I don't know what Tom Newton-Dunn's sourcing on that is. I wouldn't want to speculate, but I think generally, just to completely agree with Sonia's point, you really confusing the messaging at this crucial stage is really damaging, and can be really damaging. You look at other countries, it is particularly at the point where they start easing lockdown that some of them have found real problems with the public getting confused, not getting the right message. And of course, none of it is helped by the fact that things aren't being put out officially for the first time to either Parliament or to the public. And then, of course, even after things have been done, rules almost appear to be flexible after the fact, as we've seen with the Dominic Cummings case.
OK, let's just move away from British politics, from the coronavirus pandemic, and look at, disappointing news today in terms of SpaceX and the first manned US flight for 11 years, really the advent of commercial space travel with human beings on board. What do you make of this story, and how much of a breakthrough do you think it is, Sonia, in terms of how important it is for the new space age?
Well, it sounds like it was bad weather, so and that the launch has been delayed till late May. Obviously, I suppose the interesting thing about this is that it's really commercial space travel. So this is Elon Musk's company. They're hoping to set up commercial travel, I think, to the moon. It's really kind of worlds away, I suppose, from the pandemic and what we're all talking about at the moment. I think it's also significant that the US hasn't launched a space mission with astronauts since 2011, and we've seen huge cuts to NASA's funding by the Trump administration. And I think there are real questions to be asked about that, because one of the I think it's been one of the great things about the human race, our sort of scientific quest for discovery, not just on planet Earth. And it's a real shame, I think, that
it might go ahead on Saturday, Anna. Just briefly, the commercialisation of this will bring costs down and allow more space exploration.
Yes, it does, but I think it's rather curious to look at right now when we can't even get on a plane to France to be talking about travelling to space. But yes, in theory, it is all very exciting if it takes off.
Yeah, and in fact, I think they were probably sitting much closer than 2 metres apart, weren't they? Thank you both very much indeed for taking us through the first editions of the papers. Thank you both.